An army trapped on all sides, where every step could decide their survival. Today, you'll discover how the British force marched 300 miles and changed the course of an entire campaign. They had little choice, and yet every step forward would shape the fate of nations. In early 1706, Europe existed in a delicate balance of power, where alliances shifted quietly, and the ambitions of monarchs extended far beyond their own borders. Britain, though often considered an island nation insulated from continental affairs, found itself entangled in the intricate web of the War of the Spanish Succession. The conflict was less about dramatic battles and more about strategic positioning, the careful orchestration of armies, and the enduring patience of commanders who understood that timing and foresight could outweigh the mightiest forces. At the heart of this vast geopolitical struggle lay questions that would challenge the British Army. How could a relatively small force operate in foreign territory while surrounded by potentially overwhelming enemies? How could survival be ensured without igniting catastrophic confrontation? These questions were not theoretical. They demanded practical, immediate solutions that would test the limits of endurance, discipline, and leadership. The British Army was far from an impersonal instrument. Its men were disciplined but human, accustomed to the routine of camps and the slow grind of logistics. Supply lines were extended, food was never abundant, and the terrain itself could be as formidable as any enemy soldier. Commanders understood that maintaining morale in such conditions required foresight and empathy as much as authority. Every choice had consequences, and every delay could magnify the dangers that already loomed. In this environment, intelligence about the movements of French and Spanish forces became a currency as valuable as gunpowder, and misjudgment could quickly lead to disaster. The army's location was at once strategic and vulnerable, serving as a pivot in the larger campaign, but exposed to encirclement. Political context shaped every decision. Europe's monarchs were not merely interested in territory. Prestige, reputation, and influence dictated the strategies of the day. Britain's allies demanded commitment, yet each alliance carried risk. French and Spanish commanders were calculating their own paths, weighing the advantages of immediate engagement against the possibility of attrition. Britain's choices would therefore ripple outward, affecting not only the army itself, but also the broader diplomatic landscape. Understanding these pressures allows a deeper appreciation of why commanders acted cautiously, why patience could be as decisive as aggression, and why a march could become more consequential than a pitched battle. The calm discipline of preparation masked the latent tension beneath every decision. Officers discussed maps, distances, and supplies not with flourish but with precision, knowing that any miscalculation could spell the difference between survival and annihilation. The ordinary soldier, meanwhile, followed routines that might appear mundane but were integral to maintaining cohesion. The human element, the physical limits of men and horses, the endurance required for long marches, the mental strain of uncertainty, was central to the army's prospects. The story of this British force is not one of heroic charge or sudden triumph, but of careful measurement, informed foresight, and the constant weighing of risk against opportunity. By focusing first on context, geography, and strategic environment, one begins to understand why Britain's decisions in 1706 mattered as much for what was avoided as for what was achieved. There was no single dramatic moment in which all questions were answered, yet the seeds of future outcomes were planted here. The interplay of politics, terrain, supply, and human endurance formed the stage upon which choices would be tested. The army's capacity to act deliberately, even under pressure, would become the defining factor of its survival. The audience is invited into a reflective space, encouraged to consider the measured rhythm of historical decision-making rather than the flash of immediate action. Listeners can feel the weight of responsibility borne quietly by men who understood that each calculated step carried consequence. Curiosity about what would follow remains alive, as the army's next moves are yet to be revealed. The first signs of a difficult choice were already appearing on the horizon, and the decisions made here would quietly determine whether the army could endure what seemed an impossible campaign. Every step forward now carried the weight of both strategy and survival. The British Army's position in early 1706 was both crucial and precarious. Nestled in foreign terrain, far from the familiar coastlines of England, it faced the constant challenge of balancing offensive potential with the limitations imposed by distance and supply. Commanders were aware that the strength of their force alone could not guarantee security. The surrounding environment, the disposition of allied and enemy forces, and the readiness of their own men all contributed to the fragile equilibrium. Orders were crafted not in haste, but with careful consideration of the consequences. Every maneuver, every placement of troops was weighed against potential vulnerability. The army's very existence depended on foresight, anticipation, and a measured understanding of both its capabilities and its constraints. At the same time, the physical and mental demands on the soldiers were significant. These men had endured months of campaigning, moving through difficult landscapes with limited supplies and harsh weather. Their bodies carried fatigue and minor injuries, yet their discipline remained a key factor in maintaining cohesion. Officers recognized that morale was fragile and that trust between men and commanders could determine whether a column held together or disintegrated under stress. Training and experience provided guidance, but the uncertainty of foreign terrain and the unpredictable actions of France and Spain added a constant element of tension. Every decision was layered with consequence, from the route chosen for a march to the timing of a halt, and even the selection of what supplies to carry could influence the army's ability to continue. The geographic positioning of the army also created a quiet pressure. Hills, rivers, and roads were not merely obstacles but strategic variables. Each pass and valley could be advantageous or perilous depending on the enemy's movements. Commanders studied maps meticulously, calculating distances and anticipating potential encounters, knowing that a single misjudgment could leave a column exposed. The army's location was a balancing act between maintaining access to friendly territory, preserving supply lines, and avoiding encirclement by larger enemy forces. Every decision was an experiment in restraint and anticipation, requiring both patience and precision. Political considerations further constrained British options. Allies demanded commitment to campaigns, yet coordination with other forces required negotiation, timing, and compromise. France and Spain, observing these positions, could exploit delays or missteps. The British command had to weigh the reputational consequences of inaction against the practical realities of their vulnerability. Strategic caution was not merely prudence, it was a necessity. The army's leaders understood that visible hesitation could invite attack, yet rash action could be catastrophic. Their judgments balanced diplomacy, logistics, and military principle, producing a constant tension between action and endurance. Listeners can appreciate the human dimension of these calculations. Beyond maps and orders, men endured daily hardship, performing repetitive yet essential duties that sustained the army. Rest periods, ration distribution, and medical care were as critical as any tactical maneuver. The interplay of human limits with strategic necessity created a narrative of subtle heroism and quiet endurance. The focus is not on spectacle, but on understanding how measured decisions preserve life and maintain potential, even when confronted by forces far larger and more powerful. This section encourages reflection on the delicate orchestration of strategy, logistics, and human perseverance. The audience is invited to sense the constant balancing act that underpins the army's survival, to understand that every calm decision carried weight, and to feel the quiet tension of anticipation that accompanies uncertainty. By considering the army's position in this light, listeners begin to see why the coming march was not merely a movement of men, but a deliberate, consequential act of survival. As the army prepared its next moves, the tension between opportunity and risk grew, and every choice would soon test the limits of endurance and strategic judgment. Every shadow of movement beyond the horizon demanded careful attention. French and Spanish forces were far from passive observers. Across the contested regions of Europe, their commanders monitored British positions with precision, considering every maneuver, every halt, every supply convoy. The threat they posed was not only numerical but strategic, as they could leverage geography, timing, and coordination to press any advantage. The British Army's vulnerability became increasingly apparent when measured against the combined potential of France and Spain, whose forces were experienced, well-resourced, and eager to exploit any weakness. The tension was subtle yet pervasive, a constant backdrop to the routine of camp life and marches. Every choice made by British leaders was shadowed by the possibility that the enemy might anticipate, intercept, or encircle them, forcing decisions that weighed prudence above boldness. The enemy's movements were deliberate. They consolidated their positions, maneuvered to threaten supply lines, and projected a presence that tested British readiness without immediately engaging in open battle. This created a dynamic of psychological pressure as much as tactical constraint. British commanders could not rely solely on intelligence or past experience. They had to interpret the intentions of adversaries who were both patient and unpredictable. The Army's capacity to respond, to adjust, and to maintain cohesion under the persistent threat of encirclement became central to its continued survival. For the audience, understanding this interplay highlights that warfare is often measured in anticipation and endurance rather than direct confrontation. Within the army itself, men felt the growing tension in quiet, cumulative ways. Scouts returned with news of distant troop movements, sometimes ambiguous, sometimes alarming. Supplies were stretched, and the strain of repeated readiness weighed heavily on morale. Officers reviewed orders with heightened diligence, while soldiers adhered to routines with steadfastness, their discipline absorbing uncertainty one step at a time. The narrative here emphasizes restraint. The British were neither reckless nor paralyzed, but carefully weighing each possibility. This approach sustains listener attention by gradually revealing risk, keeping curiosity alive regarding how the army might respond when confrontation becomes inevitable. Strategic interpretation required constant calculation. Commanders considered terrain, seasonal conditions, and the mobility of both horse and foot. The disposition of French and Spanish forces was assessed not as abstract numbers, but as dynamic, interactive elements that could alter the outcome of any movement. Every decision where to position a detachment, how to allocate provisions, when to advance or pause, was layered with consequence. The listener is invited to appreciate the intellectual labor behind each action, fostering a sense of involvement without relying on spectacle. This measured tension reinforces calm engagement while cultivating anticipation for the Army's next critical step. The audience is subtly guided to recognize that risk does not always announce itself with immediate drama. Much of the pressure in this period was anticipatory, a constant calculation of probabilities and possible outcomes. By focusing on intent, positioning, and restraint, the story conveys the quiet heroism of foresight and endurance. British leaders understood that misjudging enemy intentions could have catastrophic effects, yet excessive caution could equally compromise the Army's initiative. Balancing these forces of risk and opportunity underlies the intellectual tension that sustains engagement, particularly for listeners attuned to strategy, consequence, and human judgment. As the British Army watched, waited, and maneuvered within these pressures, the sense of impending decision sharpened. The enemy's presence was never immediate, yet it was always influential, shaping movement, dictating pace, and constraining choice. For the audience, this section emphasizes that much of military success arises from understanding and responding to conditions over which one has partial control, preparing the listener to appreciate the complexity of the coming choices. The shadow of the adversaries remained constant, and every observation, delay, and adjustment carried the silent weight of consequence. A single choice now would define the Army's path through uncertainty. The moment of decision arrived quietly, but with profound consequence. British commanders recognized that maintaining their current position, however defensible it appeared, carried growing risk. The Army was isolated, its supply lines stretched, and the surrounding terrain increasingly controlled by French and Spanish forces. Remaining stationary could invite encirclement or attrition, while movement presented its own perils. The choice to advance, to withdraw, or to reposition required careful calculation. Every officer understood that the consequences of a misjudgment could range from operational failure to total loss of the force. This awareness imbued each conversation, each consultation over maps and reports, with a weight that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Selecting the direction of the Army's movement was not simply a matter of geography. Commanders considered terrain, weather, and the logistical limits of men and horses. Hills, rivers, and forested valleys were assessed not merely as obstacles, but as variables that could influence the pace, cohesion, and safety of the column. Routes had to be chosen that balanced speed with security and rest with progress. Supplies had to be allocated with precision, understanding that exhaustion and scarcity could undermine discipline faster than any enemy action. Each decision reflected a careful negotiation between risk and necessity, and the command structure functioned as a lens through which these factors were constantly evaluated. The human element shaped every calculation. Soldiers, though disciplined, were finite in endurance. Fatigue accumulated silently over weeks of readiness and movement. Officers measured not only distance but capacity, how far men could march, how long horses could carry loads, how quickly the column could recover after each exertion. The responsibility of leadership was as much about preserving life and cohesion as it was about achieving tactical advantage. Listeners can sense the quiet tension of responsibility, the understanding that courage was expressed not in rash action, but in informed, measured choices that sustained an entire force. Political and strategic implications further complicated the decision. Britain's allies depended on continued presence, yet the Army's maneuver could influence perceptions of strength, reliability, and initiative. French and Spanish commanders observed closely, anticipating movements that might expose vulnerability or offer opportunity. Every adjustment had potential diplomatic and military consequences, and each command required balancing short-term safety with long-term objectives. This context allows listeners to appreciate the subtle interplay of strategy, human endurance, and situational awareness, creating engagement through understanding rather than spectacle. As deliberations continued, the army prepared for the march with methodical precision. Supply trains were organized, scouts were deployed to verify routes, and instructions were issued to maintain cohesion under pressure. Men followed routines that, though familiar, carried greater importance now, as each action contributed to the army's ability to sustain movement under threat. The story emphasizes the quiet preparation and measured anticipation that often precedes significant events, inviting the audience to experience the tension inherent in careful, consequential decision-making. The broader lesson emerges clearly. Decisive movement requires courage tempered by judgment. Risk could not be avoided, yet it could be managed through foresight, discipline, and careful assessment. The Army's capacity to act deliberately under uncertainty and pressure set the stage for the actions to follow. For listeners, the focus on reasoning and human limitation sustains curiosity, fostering a reflective engagement with the unfolding narrative. Every plan was provisional, every path contingent, and every choice carried both possibility and danger. The first steps of the march tested resolve in quiet, relentless ways. The army moved not with fanfare or clashing arms, but with careful, deliberate pacing that reflected both necessity and strategy. Each column of men, each formation of cavalry and supply wagons proceeded with measured caution, conscious that the terrain itself could be as challenging as any enemy force. Hills and valleys slowed progress, rivers demanded coordination to cross, and every turn in the road required judgment to maintain order. The decision to advance was no longer theoretical. It was a continuous living process, measured in steps, hours, and the capacity of men and animals to endure the strain. The audience is invited to experience the rhythm of the march, to feel the tension inherent in movement under uncertainty, and to appreciate the quiet heroism embedded in persistence rather than spectacle. Logistics became the unspoken battlefield. Provisions were allocated with precision, and the timing of rest periods required careful oversight. Horses, essential for mobility and transport, were closely monitored to avoid exhaustion that could cripple the army's capacity to continue. Even minor oversights, a delayed supply wagon, a miscounted ration, could have cascading effects on morale and operational efficiency. Officers were constantly assessing, recalculating, and communicating adjustments to maintain cohesion. The army's survival depended as much on attention to these details as on any confrontation with enemy forces. Listeners are subtly guided to understand that history is shaped not only by grand battles, but by the disciplined execution of routine under pressure. The psychological dimension of movement was equally significant. Soldiers faced the dual challenge of physical exertion and the uncertainty of enemy observation. Scouts and lookouts reported sporadically, leaving commanders to interpret incomplete information and anticipate threats that might never materialize. The men marched with a sense of purpose, yet with awareness of vulnerability, their discipline reinforced by the shared knowledge that every step contributed to collective survival. For the audience, this creates a space of reflective engagement, emphasizing human endurance and foresight rather than immediate action. Terrain dictated more than pace. It influenced perception, strategy, and decision-making. Narrow passes, open plains, and wooded stretches each demanded distinct approaches. Leaders balanced speed with security, often choosing longer routes to avoid potential ambushes or obstacles. These choices reflect a profound understanding of risk management and the value of prudence over impulsive action. Listeners are invited to track these decisions, cultivating curiosity about how careful planning and adaptation influence outcomes under constant pressure. Coordination across the army was essential. Each segment moved in synchronization, maintaining lines of communication, ensuring that stragglers or supply elements did not fall behind, and adjusting formations to respond to subtle changes in terrain or intelligence. This operational discipline reinforced cohesion and enabled the army to function as a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. The audience experiences a calm sense of forward momentum, guided by the knowledge that each decision contributes to collective endurance and the unfolding narrative. The march itself became a proving ground of human capability and strategic foresight. Every challenge, weather, fatigue, terrain, or uncertainty about enemy positions, was met with deliberation. The focus remained on maintaining control, preserving the army's ability to act, and ensuring that every calculated step brought them closer to safety and operational continuity. Curiosity is sustained as the audience senses the mounting difficulty and anticipates how these measured efforts will interact with external pressures in the sections to come. The journey pressed onward steadily. Each mile walked a quiet testament to discipline, patience, and resilience. Threat did not always announce itself with drums or battle cries. For weeks, the British Army moved under the shadow of unseen pressure. French and Spanish forces were never far away, their presence a subtle but constant reminder that danger was never entirely absent. Commanders had to calculate movements with the knowledge that any exposure could be exploited, yet the enemy's restraint created a peculiar tension. They could press, threaten, or intimidate without engaging directly. This persistent uncertainty demanded continuous assessment, as every choice carried weight, and every pause could open opportunity for disaster. The audience is invited to sense that strategy often unfolds in quiet restraint, where survival depends more on measured judgment than on visible confrontation. The psychological pressure on soldiers was tangible. Long marches and constant vigilance weighed heavily, and yet discipline endured. Men moved with focus, responding to orders, maintaining formations, and enduring fatigue without complaint. Officers monitored the subtle signs of strain, adjusting pace or rest to preserve cohesion. Decisions were not made in isolation. They reflected accumulated knowledge, experience, and a constant balancing of immediate need against longer-term endurance. The Army's survival depended on the careful calibration of human effort, and listeners are drawn into the rhythm of anticipation, feeling the slow accumulation of tension that underlies every step. Terrain remained a crucial factor in maintaining both security and flexibility. Passes, hills, and river crossings were navigated with deliberation, as leaders calculated where the Army could move safely and how quickly it could respond to unexpected developments. Scouts reported sporadically, sometimes ambiguously, forcing commanders to interpret information and anticipate threats without certainty. These choices reinforced the importance of foresight and patience, allowing listeners to appreciate the measured, almost meditative quality of strategic decision-making under continuous stress. The Army's cohesion became a quiet triumph. Every wagon, every squad, every contingent had to maintain pace and position. Supply chains were delicate, and any disruption could compromise the entire column. Leaders continuously adjusted formations, provided instructions, and reinforced discipline, ensuring that the Army functioned as an integrated whole. For the audience, the focus on organization and careful management emphasizes that military success is often grounded in endurance, attention to detail, and human resilience rather than dramatic action. Meanwhile, the enemy's presence imposed constant calculations. French and Spanish commanders could have engaged decisively, yet they chose to maneuver, probe, and position themselves strategically. This created a form of tension that demanded both patience and judgment from the British. Every move, every observation, every halt required evaluation. Listeners experienced the steady, accumulating suspense of a campaign shaped by anticipation, where the threat is real yet controlled, and where every decision contributes incrementally to the Army's potential survival. This section highlights the quiet pressure of constrained action. Risk is ever present, but managed through careful observation, flexibility, and discipline. The audience is encouraged to reflect on the subtle interplay between human endurance, strategic insight, and situational awareness, recognizing that much of history's decisive moments emerge from prolonged, methodical processes rather than immediate drama. The rhythm of movement, the unbroken chain of decisions, and the constant attention to detail create a space of sustained curiosity and calm focus. Each day of the march demonstrated that restraint, vigilance, and disciplined adaptation could sustain life even under relentless, invisible pressure. Relief arrived not with celebration, but with measured understanding of survival. After weeks of careful maneuvering, the British Army reached a point where the immediate threat from French and Spanish forces began to diminish. The careful orchestration of movement, the constant attention to terrain and logistics, and the disciplined endurance of soldiers and officers alike culminated in a moment of provisional safety. Commanders could at last assess the progress made and recognize that deliberate patience had preserved the Army from what might have been disaster. The audience is invited to share in a quiet sense of satisfaction, not through spectacle, but through appreciation of sustained effort and well-judged decisions that allowed men to continue their campaign intact. The culmination of the march reflected the accumulation of countless choices. Every halt, every adjustment, every allocation of supplies had contributed to survival. Commanders had balanced the risk of exposure with the need for forward movement, constantly monitoring both enemy activity and the condition of their own forces. Soldiers, though fatigued, had maintained discipline and cohesion, demonstrating the human capacity to endure prolonged stress when guided by competent leadership. Listeners are drawn into this continuum of quiet heroism, understanding that history often turns not on singular acts of bravery, but on the steady execution of reasoned, thoughtful decisions over time. Evaluation of terrain and resources became central at this stage. Leaders observed the surrounding environment with renewed attention, confirming that the routes chosen had minimized exposure to danger while maintaining access to vital supply lines. The strategic advantages of movement, rather than static defense, were now evident. By tracing the outcomes of earlier judgments, the audience gains insight into the cumulative effect of careful planning, the iterative process of adaptation, and the subtle ways in which human endurance shapes strategic outcomes. The Army's cohesion and morale were equally significant. Maintaining confidence in the men required more than directives. It demanded visible evidence that decisions had tangible benefits. Troops recognized that their efforts were rewarded with safety, and the trust between men and officers reinforced stability within the ranks. Listeners are encouraged to consider how human relationships, communication, and shared understanding underpin the functioning of complex organizations under pressure. The narrative remains calm, reflective, and immersive, fostering intellectual engagement and a sustained emotional connection with the story. French and Spanish forces, meanwhile, had recalibrated their positions in response to the British march. Their initial numerical advantage had not translated into decisive action, and the British Army's careful movement had prevented encirclement or unnecessary engagement. This demonstrates the quiet interplay of strategy, restraint, and endurance, showing that sometimes the absence of battle can be the most telling measure of successful command. For the audience, the focus on consequence over spectacle reinforces the reflective tone and sustains curiosity about the broader significance of the Army's survival. This stage of the campaign highlights the power of calculated decision-making and patience. The Army's leaders balanced risk and opportunity continuously, preserving the force while shaping future operational options. Listeners experience a sense of calm achievement, tempered by awareness that the situation remains complex and contingent. By emphasizing the intellectual and human dimensions of endurance, this section maintains engagement without resorting to dramatic highs, inviting the audience to appreciate the subtlety and sophistication of historical strategy. The Army had survived, but the consequences of its endurance were still unfolding, and the lessons of measured, disciplined action would shape the wider campaign in ways that only careful reflection could reveal. The true impact of the march revealed itself in the quiet aftermath. With the immediate threat of French and Spanish forces receding, the British Army's endurance became more than a survival story. It was a strategic turning point that shaped the broader campaign. The decisions made during the weeks of careful movement had preserved not only lives, but also operational capacity. Commanders could now influence subsequent operations with a force still intact, while allies and adversaries alike were forced to reassess assumptions about Britain's ability to sustain operations in foreign territory. The audience is invited to reflect on the long-term significance of measured action, understanding that history often hinges on sustained judgment rather than sudden victory. The preservation of the Army had multiple consequences. Politically, it reinforced Britain's credibility with allies, demonstrating that strategic patience and disciplined planning could achieve outcomes that brute force alone might not secure. Strategically, the Army remained capable of influencing key regions, maintaining pressure on enemy positions without unnecessary engagement. Militarily, the lessons of endurance, cohesion, and careful logistical planning became embedded in the institutional memory of the force, informing subsequent campaigns and establishing a standard for operational prudence. Listeners are encouraged to appreciate the interplay of human judgment, preparation, and circumstance that allows small forces to exert influence far beyond their immediate size. The march also reshaped perceptions among commanders. French and Spanish leaders recognized that the British Army's survival was not accidental. It reflected disciplined strategy, adaptability, and foresight. The inability to force engagement highlighted the limitations of numerical superiority when faced with deliberate, cautious maneuvering. For the audience, this illustrates the quiet but decisive impact of reasoned command, showing that power can manifest in restraint as much as in aggression. The story emphasizes that enduring success often depends on understanding both opportunity and limitation, rather than relying on chance or brute strength. Human endurance remained central to the narrative. Soldiers who had endured weeks of constant movement, fatigue, and uncertainty returned with the knowledge that discipline and cooperation had preserved their lives. Officers' judgments, though often invisible, had guided them through the complexity of terrain, supply constraints, and enemy observation. The listener is invited to consider the cumulative weight of countless decisions, small and large, and how these together shape outcomes that may appear simple in retrospect, but were contingent at every step. This fosters a reflective, immersive experience, allowing calm appreciation of strategy and human resilience. The long-term significance of the march extended beyond immediate operations. The Army's ability to navigate hostile territory safely influenced subsequent campaigns, as planners incorporated lessons learned into future deployments. The demonstration of disciplined endurance and logistical competence shaped both doctrine and expectation, providing a model for how limited forces could maintain relevance and effectiveness even under threat. For the audience, this reinforces the theme that history is often a product of foresight, preparation, and measured action, rather than dramatic confrontation. In the broader scope of the War of the Spanish Succession, the march illustrates how strategic patience, foresight, and disciplined execution can alter the course of events quietly but profoundly. Survival itself became an achievement, enabling Britain to remain a credible actor in European affairs. Listeners are left with the understanding that the most consequential moments in history may not be defined by spectacle, but by enduring judgment and the careful orchestration of human effort. The Army's march, once an uncertain experiment in endurance, became a defining example of strategic foresight and human resilience, demonstrating that the quiet, disciplined exercise of judgment can shape outcomes as decisively as any battle.